Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in The Stream. Today, the disturbing way in which many mentally ill prisoners are treated in the U.S. So our digital producer, Omar Badar, is here looking out for all of your live feedback, and I know it's already coming in. What have you seen so far?
You know, a lot of people are sharing the grievance that this issue has been widely ignored. So you have Eka Zochi here who says, this is so important. Why doesn't corporate media pay more attention to this? Thank you, Al Jazeera, for exposing these inequities. And then when we put out the question of who's responsible for the current treatment of mentally ill inmates, you have Damie Junkin here who says, all of us, mental health is stigmatized on many levels. Prisoners are vulnerable. No one speaks for them. They are easy to ignore. Now, because of the footage that came out of this report by Human Rights Watch about the way inmates are being treated, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a little bit more difficult to ignore them. Folks at home, you can join this conversation by tweeting us using the hashtag AJStream. And in the meantime, here's a look at some of the other stories that we're following.
Extreme and often unnecessary force is being used against mentally ill U.S. prisoners. That's according to Human Rights Watch. A new report examines how jail and prison staff allegedly abused inmates with tasers, pepper spray, and excessive restraint. A quick warning, some people may find some of the images in today's show hard to watch.
I don't know, the prison's kind of funny. I don't know if you have a seizure or not. We get in trouble for not doing things.
Lopez, we're going to take you out of the chair. Okay. Maybe be a little more comfortable. Holler if anything changes. Okay.
Like you should stop breathing.
Well, Christopher Lopez, the mentally ill inmate you just saw in that video, died during that incident. Lopez suffered seizures, which correctional staff ignored. His lawyer said his condition was treatable if he had received prompt medical attention. So what can be done to address the mental health of prisoners while maintaining a secure and safe prison environment for everyone? Here to discuss that, we have in New York, Jamie Fellner, senior advisor with Human Rights Watch and the author of the report. In Los Angeles, Insung Philip Cho, a mental health advocate and former inmate at LA's Twin Towers Correctional Facility, who says he suffered physical abuse while in jail. Gary Harkins, a retired corrections officer with the Oregon State Penitentiary, who currently serves as research director for the American Correctional Officer Intelligence Network. And in Chicago, Ellie Montgomery, deputy director for mental health policy and advocacy at the Cook County Sheriff's Department. Welcome to The Stream, all of you. Now, Jamie, this is quite a lengthy investigation, all 127 pages of it. What stuck out to you as the most eye-opening revelation regarding mental illness in U.S. prisons?
I don't think when I started this, I realized how much injury and even death was happening because people express their mental illness and symptoms that violate prison rules. I knew there was a tension between the needs of the mentally ill and the way prisons and jails are run, but I had no idea the extent of violence and that people were dying because they were excessively pepper sprayed, because they were tasered, because they were ignored.
Right. Well, Ellie, this is your everyday. What is a typical day like for you? Because I know that you screen inmates when they come in for mental illnesses. So describe a day for us.
So first I want to comment that Cook County was not on that report. We are very lucky to have a sheriff that has been on the forefront of focusing and advocating on behalf of those that are suffering from mental illness. During the day, we have everyone that's been arrested in Chicago. We have a screening area in which we do in-depth rapid assessments to determine if someone is mentally ill. This is difficult. It's challenging. That information gets to the public defender before bond court, and also to the state's attorney to make referrals for mental health court and treatment court, as well as veterans court. So along with that, we're able to follow who gets an I bond, so who gets to just go from court out to the community. We are able to look at who comes into the jail, where they land, and we specifically work closely with our CERMAC, who is the medical and mental health provider. So we have areas in the jail where officers are psych trained, and they are familiar with how to work with those that are suffering from mental illness, as well as a triage team, multidisciplinary team with officers, trained directors, and mental health staff. And so this is something that there's no doubt it's a challenge. And first and foremost, I just want to say that these folks shouldn't be, I think we can all agree that anyone suffering from severe mental illness that is not a danger in the community should not be in jail, period.
Well, Ellie, I'm wondering how you determine and identify what signs are you looking for? This is basically spot judgment, or are you interviewing people? How do you know?
So in Chicago, although it's a big city, it's a small community in terms of psychiatric staff and hospitals. So I've been in the field for 25 years. If people are able to name psychiatric medication to me, such as Depakote, Haldol, Prolixin, old school meds that were used in institutions before they were placed in the community, and these are older folks, and now they might be self-medicating with other medications because they can't get their meds because all the funding's been cut in Chicago. So through self-report, as well as if they're naming their psychiatrists, I know them. I know the hospitals. There's not a whole lot of places where you can get behavioral health treatment, and that's even gotten worse.
Ellie, I assume, though, that you, even with the screening that you try and do, that there are people who end up in your facility who, in fact, do have a mental illness, or who maybe weren't on meds before they arrived, or if they were, they didn't mention it, because you do have quite a population of mentally ill who are behind bars. And although, as you point out, Cook County wasn't included in our report, that was because of space limitations. There's serious use of force problems in your facility, which I know you're working hard to address, and you have a federal court monitor working on it. There's been a new class action case, which the judge said, I mean, it's sort of, the litigation continues. But I know you, like jails across the country, have a difficult time, as good as your training is, making sure that the mentally ill aren't disproportionately victimized by excessive or unnecessary force.
The Cook County and LA are the largest mental health institutions in the country right now.
Yep.
Hey, can I speak up about LA and the screening process here done at Twin Towers Correctional Facility?
Go ahead, Bill.
At Twin Towers, or the reception area for the Twin Towers and Men's Central Jail, the only screening they do is to check to see if you have HIV, if you admit to that, or if you say you're suicidal. There is very little screening done on people with mental illness. In the last couple of years, I believe they did add some screening, but it's done by mental health workers and not by psychiatrists. So there's no evaluation or diagnosis that is attached to each inmate, which is critical for their care. If you do not know what their disease is or their illness, how can you treat them? And so the screening process here in LA County is terrible. They have no idea what illness you have, let alone what medication you need and the
But
proper treatment for that.
even if they know what illness you have, and even if that you are receiving the appropriate medication, which you may or may not be in any given facility, there's still the question of if you engage, you're in a jail, you're in a prison. If you engage in behavior that the correctional staff decide is problematic, the correctional staff makes the decision whether or not to use force. Mental health staff, and Ellie, correct me if I'm wrong, in Cook County, mental health staff are often not involved, even consulted before force is used, and they don't have any say in whether correctional staff decide that they're...
I'm going to correct you on that. So
Yeah.
and I think we're very lucky in this because we've been on the forefront and ahead of this before the majority of the media has been. So Sheriff Dart has been advocating on behalf of this since he's been in office, elected into office. So I think that the real issue here is, obviously we all agree that anyone with a severe mental illness should never be incarcerated, that there should be some kind of deflection, that at the time of, on the street with someone that's suffering from mental illness, that they have another place to go. And if police do interact with that individual, they're trained and there's another avenue to avoid the entire criminal justice system. That being said, in Cook County Jail, we have areas where people are thoroughly screened for mental illness. We have a range of medical and mental health providers that work together as a team, and we are looking at where they should be housed, and those officers are psych trained. So they are involved when someone is out of control, and I agree that when someone's not medicated and they're agitated, crisis intervention training is key. So having one person being able to speak.
And Jamie and Ellie, the points, of course, that you're raising, I want to let our international audience know that, of course, it is different in every prison system that we see, as the report ultimately.
Yeah, very.
Exactly, and I see Gary nodding his head, but I want to get our community in because they have a lot to say on this topic.
So we have a lot of people online who are raising basically saying that the reason why many people get away with abuse in these situations is because everybody just dismisses people who are in prison as criminals. You have Shiz here who says in the end they just want us to think, oh, they are criminals, that's okay, they deserve what they're getting. And then you have Tigatos here who basically agrees with that judgment. He says they should not get special treatment, they should be treated the same as everyone else. If you do the crime, you do the time. So Gary, what can you say to the people commenting online, basically from your experience, about why people who are mentally ill should get different treatment than the general prison population?
Well, the problem with them is that they cause a lot of disruptions. And when you have a tier of inmates going off because you have one person acting out, banging, making noises, it causes the others to act out. And then instead of one person acting out, you've got 40 people acting out. So a lot of times you need to go in and remove that person. You need to put them someplace where they won't disrupt. But the problem is that most facilities are not designed to do that. Most facilities do not have the money to have the appropriate staff there to try and talk the person down. A lot of counties around my area, they're lucky if they can put a deputy on the road. They don't have the money to staff their facilities. So
it's a huge problem. It's absolutely a huge problem. They don't I mean, the audience, the international audience may not be aware that in the United States there are 5,100 jails and prisons. Each state has its own prison system. The jails are mostly operated at a county level. And there's not enough money to ensure that in each of those facilities there's mental health staff available, and that the correctional officers or jail deputies are trained in how to respond in a de-escalating way to take care of people who are acting out. For the audience person who said, if you do the crime, do the time, I find that a rather old-fashioned, callous approach to criminal justice. But I would point out that if somebody has a broken leg and you put him in jail, you wouldn't expect that person to go work, let's say, or put him in prison, you wouldn't expect him to work in the field with a broken leg. If somebody has cancer and needs medication for the cancer, you'd expect that person to get it.
When you,
Well, Jamie,
Mental
Jamie,
illness,
I want to pick up
mental-
on a point that you raised about funding, about how it differs across different jail and prison systems. There's actually a couple of stats that we're featuring in the Streams app, so you can all get this if you download the app, but this is just a few of them, and some of them might be pretty shocking. 44 is the number of states where at least one prison or jail holds more people with mental illness than the largest state-run psychiatric hospital. Another stat, $4.35 billion is the amount that states in the U.S. cut in mental health spending. And 4,500, that's the number of public psychiatric hospital beds that were eliminated, and that's a time period between 2009 and to 2012. So Phil, when you see stats like this, to you, does this tell you that we've basically shifted the responsibility of mental health to prisons? Do you think you would have been better off if you'd been sent to a hospital?
Oh, definitely. I think the case here in Los Angeles at Twin Towers is that it is what I call the revolving door policy at Twin Towers. People with mental illness are picked up on a daily basis for minor crimes. They're arrested and booked and placed in Twin Towers, and they're never treated properly. So their condition gets worse and worse and worse. And once they're let out, they go to the streets, and most of them end up in Skid Row here in Los Angeles, downtown LA, and they get rearrested for another minor crime and go right back to Twin Towers where they're not treated again. And the cycle just repeats and repeats and repeats.
And there's another piece that's even sort of more tragic. You pick somebody up on a minor crime, urinating in public, let's say. The person is decompensating, you bring him to the jail, and the person gets resistant and swings at an officer. Now, suddenly that person is facing a charge of assaulting a police officer. Now they're looking at serious time.
right, yeah.
Well, and I think to add to that, to both comments, one is, yes, there's a revolving door. There's also a revolving door in mental health hospitals. So that on another date should really be addressed. But the real issue that around this is that we are running a mental health hospital in Chicago as well as a jail simultaneously. That's the reality. I think that's probably the reality in LA. I would guess that's the reality in larger cities. So I think that's in common, okay? Because of the lack of funding, the lack of support, and along with just not understanding that people with mental illness will continue to have nonviolent offenses or crimes of survival, if you will, in order to, a roof over your head. It's cold in Chicago. In LA, it's a little warmer, but still, you get hungry, you're thirsty. And so, yes, over and over and over, and clearly not a financial sound plan, we have people that languish in the jail unnecessarily when they can get treatment in the community. So I think we're all in agreement on that. The person that comes in who is actively psychotic and hits an officer, we have a hearing board in Chicago where we have mental health staff on that hearing board to negotiate what is going on with that individual to determine whether that person indeed needs to go to segregation, get treatment, but also there's a message about how everyone needs to have some accountability in their behavior.
Right.
But first and foremost, what are we dealing with here? So I agree that an assessment on the front end is crucial to see, what is going on with this detainee.
Yep. So we have a lot of people
Ellie,
online who
there's a tension there between, you were absolutely right when you said you're faced with an impossible job. You're trying to run a jail at the same time you're running a de facto mental health facility. But there are contradictions between jails and mental health, the needs of running a jail securely and safely, and how to run a mental health facility. And those two cultures don't mesh. So oftentimes mental health gets shortchanged because security rules trump what might be mental health rules.
Yep.
I'll just give one example, maybe not from Chicago, but Florida. You have a guy decompensating in the Florida State Prison. And he's banging on the door. They pepper spray him. They pepper spray him. They pepper spray him. Eventually, he gets moved to the inpatient facility, which is actually run like an inpatient hospital, where pepper spray isn't permitted, and the guy gets treated and calms down. But that's very difficult and costly.
So, Jamie, just on that point of these cultures not going together, we have people weighing in. We asked the question of what about training for these corrections officers in mental health issues? And you have Noel here who says mental illness is serious and needs to be handled by doctors, not by correction officers. And then you have Colm here who says, I'd say test them, correction officers, for mental health issues rather than train them on mental health issues. Gary, to that point, do you think that officers are basically, can you talk a little bit about the stresses of doing the job and whether they have the support that they need so that they can be in a better position to handle these situations? Do they have, are they in a good place in these environments where they themselves maybe are not, do they themselves need help to handle these situations a little bit better?
Yes, they do need help. First off, they're lucky if they get any training on mental health in either at their academy or in yearly training. Currently in Oregon, you get 4 hours. But over 42,000 COs are assaulted every year. That's 5 a day or 5 an hour. It's a very stressful job. The job changes you for the worse. In a study that came out, 31% of us have PTSD, some sort of PTSD. The troops who came back from Iraq were 15 to 20%. So we have a very high PTSD rate. We have a very high suicide rate. We have a very high divorce rate. We have a very high drug and alcohol abuse rate. So when you have staff who are suffering from PTSD, there's no treatment for the inmate, there's no treatment for the staff. So you've got a broken officer trying to deal with a broken inmate, and that just doesn't work a lot of times.
And of course, you also have departments who say that they are trying to deal with this. We actually got a statement from the LA Sheriff's Department. I'll read that here. The Sheriff's Department, they say, remains committed to the appropriate treatment of all inmates in our custody and has made significant reforms to custody operations by working to implement the recommendation of the Citizens Commission, the Department of Justice, and the federal court. And Phil, I can see you, of course, listening intently to that statement because this is the county where you were imprisoned. What do you see the way forward as being? What's your alternative?
Definitely, I think mental health diversion, which is being brought up by the district attorney of LA County. She's recommending that instead of jail, that mentally ill people who break the law or minor offenses who are nonviolent are diverted from jail and placed in treatment centers where they receive the medication, therapy, counseling, what all the different types of treatments you receive at a regular facility, and maybe including long-term housing. Basically, the cost of doing diversion is less than the cost of keeping them in jail or prison.
Right.
So the county will save money, and the taxpayers will be happier that the people are being treated, and less of their tax money is being wasted on the jail system.
And of course, I see both Gary and Ellie nodding their heads, and you hear an absolutely from Jamie. I want to give the last word to our community before we head into the post show, where I'll get all of the rest of your recommendations for what should be done. So join us there. But Omar, what are they saying?
We have a video comment here from Patton that kind of just talks about the psychology of people who are dealing with these problems. Take a listen.
Toughest charge I ever received in the state of South Carolina was 3 days after not receiving my meds from behind bars while they were, watching me for suicide. And so it's, I don't think they're trained enough. I don't think they're paid enough. I don't think they care enough. I think that they're like adult babysitters in jails, and they just want to make their lives easy as possible.
Of course, it's interesting to hear those first-person accounts. It really makes the story hit home for so many of us. Fortunately, that's all the time we have now for this conversation, this part of the conversation. So we're going to pause, continue in our post-show at stream.aljazeera.com. A big thank you to our guests and, of course, our community. Now on the next show, do so-called trigger warnings for distressing content limit free speech? We'll tap into the ongoing debate in the United States about their use on college campuses and beyond. But before that, we have the post show where we'll get recommendations and alternatives to mental health illnesses in prisons. We'll see you then. Welcome to the post show. Let's jump right back into our conversation. This is one of those shows where everybody online has so much to say to add to the conversation, but all of our guests also have so much to say. So we're going to go to the community and hear what they've been thinking of the conversation as we've been having it.
Yep. So you have Arlene here commenting on Facebook about the big picture. She says, it was under the Reagan administration, that's the administration in charge in the U.S. in the 80s, when mental health rehab facilities were closed and all the patients turned out onto the streets. So, Jamie, this is not an issue of us as a society having never cared about this, but there was a change. I mean, there was a time when there were more mental facilities and they have been systematically shut down. What has changed?
That's missing the point. Back then, what's called deinstitutionalization was a very good thing. You had people being warehoused involuntarily for years and decades and not getting mental health treatment.
It was never funded.
Those were shut down, but the point was that they were supposed to be shut down so that people who had been in them would be getting mental health treatment, including, if necessary, residential inpatient treatment in the community, where they could
we
go.
have as many
but what
mental
happened
health
was
beds
that
as we had in 1850.
no, the point is that the good news was those facilities were shut down, but the shutting down has continued to this day far more so that people don't have access to community-based resources. Mental health systems in the community are a shambles, and there are not enough beds for people who do need hospital beds. Absolutely, it's a huge problem. It also goes with poverty and homelessness, and the fact that this country doesn't really do a very good job of taking care of its most vulnerable.
Ellie, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just completely agree, and I support everything that was said. I think the issue here is, the goal was to not violate mental health rights, civil rights, and so getting people out of those insane asylums, is what they were called, into the community. And what failed in that plan was not having enough resources in the community. And we have repeated history, because now, instead of having a mental health hospital, we have jails, and that's where everyone has ended up, because there is, at least in Chicago, no housing. There isn't enough programs. There's waiting lists. And so, people go out in the street. We have a discharge plan. We do our best to get them linked into the community, but there's waiting lists. And so where does the person stay before they get their treatment? How long does it take to get their meds? How do they navigate the system?
Well, Gary, and looking towards how we change the system, re-navigate the system, really, as Ellie said, I want to play a clip. This is from the Human Rights Watch report, and use it to ask you a question, but first have a look at this.
Officers are taught that inmates need to obey. I mean, it's a militaristic, top-down organization. So a lot of orders are barked, like cuff up, stand up for count, do what I say right now.
Your refusal to comply with my orders of voluntary exit is noted. In accordance to California Code of Regulations, Title 15, 3268, we are authorized to use force, including chemical agents, to physically extract you.
So, Gary, is this a problem of training? Were you adequately given mental health awareness training?
No. My first week on the job, I had no training, and I was placed in the psychiatric security unit, where they wanted to see, I guess, how I was going to fit into the system, and to whether I was going to be a good CO or not. So when I did go to the academy after that first week, I got maybe 2 hours of training. In my 25 years, I got another 3 hours of training. Now they are changing it to where you have 4 hours of training in the academy, and you may get an hour or two every year after that. We do not train our staff adequately at all.
Gary, did you get training, or does your staff today in Oregon get training in crisis intervention, de-escalation techniques? Apart from training in mental illness, are they trained how to manage difficult, volatile situations without recourse to force?
The training is part verbal judo. That's part of the 2 or 3 hours you may get every year.
Verbal judo.
And that's it.
Can you describe that for us? What does that look like?
Well, it's a way of trying to de-escalate a situation. You talk to the person. You try to calm them down. It's a way of, he's coming at you with very angry statements, and you're trying to neutralize those statements. You're trying to neutralize him a little bit, trying to calm him down. A lot of times it doesn't work.
Right.
you know, and the thing you're left with is going in and using force. Now, one of the things I have learned is that pepper spray does not work most of the time on the mentally ill. You're wasting your time by spraying them over and over and over again. I had some guys who loved it. It was their candy. They liked it. They wanted it. They wanted them to be sprayed. So they now, you know, they go to the taser. But that is used when the person is acting out, being very violent, and causing a disruption where you've got 40 other people banging on the walls, they're flooding the tiers, and you're telling this guy to kill himself, while the staff are trying to talk him out of the cell so that they could isolate him and calm him down. You know, it's
a vivid picture.
The taser should never be used when someone is not posing an immediate threat to the well-being of somebody else or himself. Tasers are wholly disproportionate force.
And that's probably one of the more disturbing
if you have to go in on an inmate, and it's better to tase him than to end up with broken bones. You zap him, he goes rigid, you cuff him as soon as you can, and you bring him out. It's a whole lot better than...
There's so many other ways.
Excuse me, I think there's another...
So some disagreement there. I'm just going to pause you all because the community has something to say, and then we'll get right back to that. Omar.
We have a comment here from Twitter of somebody who's basically had direct interaction with the system. We have Megan Pratt who says, my husband is a therapist in the prison system, and he tries to help, but many are resistant and don't trust him. She goes on to say that until lawmakers care about our prison system at all, nothing will change. As of now, the drive to change just isn't there. Phil, from when you tell people your story, from your interactions with people, are you hopeful that we might be getting any closer to the point to where people actually care about this, to make it a policy issue and to put pressure on policymakers to take this more seriously?
Yeah, I think the main reason why I wrote my book, Twin Towers, Los Angeles, was to increase public awareness of what's happening at Twin Towers, or especially towards the mentally ill in the jail system. People are unaware of what's happening, and they don't understand the amount of suffering that's happening at Twin Towers or in county jails. It is very painful to be placed in solitary confinement for 2 months just because I told the deputy I was schizophrenic. So they placed me in 24/7 lockdown for 2 months. Solitary confinement is torture. It's worse. I did not do anything to deserve that. So people who make comments like, you know, you do the crime, do the time, they don't understand that the mentally ill have no conception of doing a crime. That is not their intent. And for me, I wanted to buy cigars. So I got arrested for buying cigars while I was delusional and hallucinating and hearing voices. And for that, I almost did a year in Twin Towers. And the amount of suffering that the mentally ill go through in jails is just mind-blowing. Solitary confinement, excessive force. I've seen kids being beat up by deputies just for walking away when the deputy's talking to them.
Well, the good news now, Phil, the good news now is that the lawsuit was settled, and Los Angeles has agreed to many, many, many changes, which hopefully will reduce the kind of experiences that you had and will lead to less violence by the deputies, including against people with mental illness. Remains to be seen, but it's a very good settlement. The provisions in it are strong.
Well, Phil, with respect to your case, we did get a statement from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. They said, we have no indication of any discipline history or documentation of any complaint submitted on your behalf while you were in their custody. For people that may be watching that this might have happened to as well, it sort of begs the question, why did you choose not to report?
I did. When I came out of jail, I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder due to the solitary confinement and to being physically assaulted by a deputy. And so I was dealing with nightmares, insomnia, just trying to sleep. On top of that, I was dealing with my mental illness, the voices, paranoia, delusions. So I had to deal with a lot of things over the last 5 years after I was incarcerated. And it took me 5 years to come to the realization that I needed to speak out and do something. So I decided to write my book, to tell my story, to let the public know what's happening. And
one
that
of
to
the
me was the
problems
best.
also, if Phil, if you had tried to report in many facilities where there is a culture of violence, such as in the Los Angeles County jails, you would just have faced retaliation. I mean, you would have had more abuse.
Interesting.
Exactly.
There's a process. There's a process in which, if there is any concern, grievances can be written by the detainees. They are confidential. Medical has a separate box in which they look at these grievances. They're monitored. We also have our OPR department, which is separate, and they follow up on all allegations. That's something else that's been incorporated into maintaining safety for everyone in the jail. And even if someone is making an allegation outside and saying, you know, my son or my loved one is being abused,
right,
that is getting followed up on. So it's taken very seriously. And I think, you know, part of what's challenging is that there is so many discrepancies. You know, if you talk about what happens in a jail, that's a pre-trial, everyone's innocent until proven guilty, compared to a prison, which everyone has they've been found guilty of a crime, and that maybe some of the lack of sensitivity on some of the tweets about, you know, you've done the crime, you know, that doesn't apply to everyone, because not everyone is guilty. So, you know, and then how do you manage these different systems? And there are different rules in relationship to a county jail versus a prison. Also, the lack of resources that you know, there doesn't seem to be any kind of consistency, is my point.
One of the
Ellie
things
and
that
Jamie,
is
I'm going to cut you
consistent-
off there because the internet is going to cut us off. And I know that there's so much more to say, but of course we can continue this conversation via online using, of course, hashtag AJStream. Our guests online are just as interested to hear what our guests on the show have to say. I love that first tweet that got brought up in the beginning of the show, because we've talked about it all throughout about doing the crime. So I want to thank all of our guests for joining us here today. Jamie Feldner,
Thank you for having us.
Philip Cho, Gary Harkins, and Ellie Montgomery. I'll give the last word to our community.
Sure. We just have Biswatosh here, who had some suggestions about how care for the mentally ill could be improved. It includes suggestions like stress reduction workshops, organized activities, providing mental health training, and availability of psychosocial support.
Long list, probably easier said than done.
Absolutely.
Now, on the next show, do alerts on potentially distressing content limit free speech? We'll tap into the ongoing debate in the United States about the use of so-called trigger warnings on college campuses and beyond. Until then, we'll see you online.